Thank you. I was talking to a friend of mine just the other day and he said, it's the same old shit. And what he meant was, it's the same human, all too human status games, obsequiousness, the chest puffing, the cruelty, the backstabbing that you get in a non-entheogenic world. And I think we'd have to admit, if we're familiar with it at all, that that's true, at least to some degree. And it may even be worse in some cases. It may be that some substances amplify narcissism and various other undesirable characteristics. That said, there's something that I can't stop myself from hoping, a kind of idea that I can't shake, and that is that these substances might somehow help us to save our own bacon. Or to put it another way, that maybe a better way, is that if enough humans jump through the liquid mirror and marinate their souls in the entheogenic milk, then we might have a better chance of saving ourselves. So to that end, I should have actually asked how this works. Let's see. To that end, I want to introduce you to Enthearchy. Enthearchy is a neologism formed from two word parts, entheo, divine within, and also arche, meaning first principle, origin, beginning, and derivatively archos, from which we get leader and ruler. I'm here drawing on the sociology of Peter Sorokin, the Russian-American sociologist, and also Eric Voegelin, the German-American historian of ideas, for this concept, because not that they spend any time really on entheogens, but they emphasized in their various ways that a fruitful way of understanding human societies is in terms of their understandings of the ultimate value, ultimate truth, ultimate reality. My suggestion is that enthearchy in the first place would be a kind of classification, which would be essentially just descriptive of those societies that have utilized entheogens in a socially legitimated way, even if it was in some ways esoteric, to inform their understandings of the ultimate. And those understandings of the ultimate, of truth and value and reality, then would feed in authoritative ways, even if contested ways, into their self-reproduction, into their social reproduction, social self-ordering. So that would be the first kind of, the baseline understanding of what enthearchy is. It's simply a kind of a unit in a cultural or socio-political taxonomy. It's interesting that if you look at it in these terms, we actually don't have a term as yet for such societies. I think we can try and stretch the term shamanic, but if you think about, say, the society of the Indus Valley, which gave rise to the Vedas and the Upanishads, or to ancient Greece with its relationship with the Eleusinian mysteries and probably other mystery religions, or to the Aztecs in the way that the flesh of the gods and other substances were crucial to their own self-understandings and self-orderings, you can see that in those societies, that they're definitely post-shamanic societies. The social function of the shaman has differentiated into, on the one hand, the legislator, and on the other hand, the priest or the sage or the philosopher or the king. So I would say that enthearchy would be a term that would be worthwhile in its application, not only to the traditional shamanic societies, but also to these later Iron Age civilizations, and also potentially to future societies. At the same time, I want to suggest that enthearchy could also be the name of a political ideal, of a kind of utopian fiction, and something that we could think through and allow to inhabit our minds and give conceptual sort of differentiation to, and in that manner develop a kind of a platform which would allow us to think not only critically about the present, because that's already available to us, but to think seriously how the entheogens might actually help to resolve not just our own individual problems or subcultural problems, but actually face up to the historical bottleneck that we're going through. Now, the first point, I guess, or the first thing to admit in this context is that enthearchy as such is not the name of something desirable. Enthearchies have included cannibalistic, imperialistic, militaristic, caste-ridden societies full of delusions, for example, about the sacrifice of small children for the movement of the sun and so forth. These are evidently not desirable characteristics for any future society. On the other hand, most of those things, cannibalism, militarism, imperialism, and so on, have been there regardless of entheogens in other societies. And also there have been many societies that were enthearchic, according to the definition I gave, that were relatively egalitarian and relatively ecologically attuned. And that includes some that are in various non-state, basically kinship, non-literate societies today in the Amazon basin and elsewhere. So I would want to suggest that a subset of enthearchy, which would be the enthearchies, the egalitarian and ecologically attuned enthearchies, is really what I think we should be aiming for. So if we grant that, the question I would want to ask is, or the question that I think is posed here is, if enthearchy, or probably an ecology of enthearchies, if that's the name of a solution, what exactly is the problem? Or put more directly, what are the specific and most crucial problems that we have to resolve if we're going to have a more decent chance? So it's relatively easy to reel off symptoms of crisis, so let me do that. You have this situation, obviously, of galloping social inequality in terms of wealth and power. We don't seem to be able to handle that. We don't know what to do with that. Or we can say we know what we should do, but we're just not doing it. We have the ecological crunch. We talk about it as a crisis, but it's probably a crunch, which is the jaws are tightening. We have the sort of techno-logos taking off. Even though it's our own work, it's just taking off as a kind of a social fate. And it's producing such things as an increasing surveillance state in conjunction with the political economy that we're stuck with. Also, a kind of engine of endless simulation, which makes it extremely difficult to find our ground. And all of this is combined with a high degree of social anxiety, the archetype of the apocalypse, and a lot of psycho-spiritual alienation. So it's easy enough to sort of run through symptoms, but how should we understand these? Well, I was going to just give you a kind of a smorgasbord of ways in which people think about this, but I'll chance giving you my own. My own is pitched in terms of the sociology and history of ideas that I suggested before, which is to say in terms of the place of the arche and the content of the arche, the first principle, the intuition of the first principle that any given society gives itself. And what we find, if I just sort of confine it to the interglacial period, the last 12,000 years or so, that we have widespread that theriomorphic gods, that is to say gods that were in animal form or combined human-animal form, were principal forms for the understanding of the origin, the ground of all being, the eternal source of creation, and so forth. This evidently instantiated a very clear understanding of our kinship with all other living things. And it had that advantage, let us put it that way. On the other hand, the characteristic difficulty here is that human exceptionalism is not allowed to come to the fore. Human self-consciousness in its individuation from all of this, let's call it a Gaian whole, maybe that's a little bit anachronistic, we call it a Gaian whole or animistic whole, is not allowed. And the price that those societies pay is that they eventually get dominated by societies that do allow for that individuated species self-consciousness. And that would take me really on to the next one. I mean, there's a sort of a transitional period, which in retrospect we might call transitional period of matriarchal earth spirits giving way to patriarchal sky gods in many places. In quite a number of Iron Age civilizations, in a period that Karl Jaspers dubbed the Axial Age, which would probably be better be called the Axial Phase, but nominally between 800 and 200 BC, you have the emergence of an intuition of the arche, an intuition of that which is the first principle, as outside of the cosmic round, as atemporal, as not subjected to any kind of duality, of whether it be male or female, dark or light, life or death, and so forth. This breakthrough to the transcendent, it ends up being extremely influential in many ways, but one way is that through one of its children, which is Christianity, it transforms the cultures of Europe, and there's a lot going on here, but one of its characteristic difficulties, of course, is that in the end, it too is highly suppressive of the human spirit. It forms an alibi for very hierarchical societies, and not to say also imperialistic and militaristic societies and so on. For a range of reasons, you get the emergence of a more self-confident human subject that begins to rebel against this order in a whole range of ways. Now, what's interesting about this, what I'm calling the era of the modern self-legislating or would-be self-legislating subject, is that it pluralizes its conception of the arche. So you have, as a rule, we go to the natural sciences for our authoritative understandings of reality. And that in turn divides into empirical experimental on the one side, which is the classically sort of English empiricist sort of approach, and on the other side, the rationalist approach, which would emphasize, let us say, the pure sciences like physics or even mathematics, and that being the locus, if not of reality, then of truth. On the other hand, we're a little bit unclear about how to locate value, but typically we've found it a struggle between locating value in the human interiority or in the dignity of human being, as we now say, and our discourse of rights, that of mutual recognition, that we each have certain kinds of inalienable rights and so on the one hand, and then the sort of real value, which is money. As we like to say, the monetary values are the values that we actually recognize. So we've got this pluralization of the arche in this context. And all of those symptoms that I talked about before, it seems to me they are symptoms of the fact that this self-legislating subject, which has to a large degree overthrown the sovereignty of the transcendent arche and located it in the individual, in the case of liberalism, in the collective, in the case of social democracy and socialism and communism and so forth, it's not been up to the job, as it were. You've had numerous attempts, and there has been a genuine humanization of many social relations, and we have a form of self-consciousness which is able to pay attention to some of the externalities, but not able to do fundamentally that much about all of those problems that I mentioned before. The efforts, for example, of the late 19th century and the 20th century under the name of socialism and communism were efforts to put that collective subject in the driving seat and take responsibility for history, but we know that they invented new forms of alienation and were, in the end, they succumbed. So I guess the question would be, two things. One would be, it seems to me that underneath all these symptoms, that the fundamental issue is not actually the issue of social control, which we often emphasize, the question of power. More fundamental, I think, is the problem of disorientation, that we are actually fundamentally lost. Now, the entheogens have kind of suggested to me that this is a fundamentally huge and rather mysterious kind of situation that we all landed in, right, at the cosmic level. But there are ways of orientating which are more open to that mystery, rather than sort of with a series of paranoid defenses. It's not just any given person who might be lost, it's actually any elite that you point a finger to. They too are lost. They can't take responsibility for the situation in any fundamental way. So it's in that context that I want to just finish off with a couple of suggestions about how entheogens might help in this broader sort of concept of enthearchy. So the first would be the idea of initiation. And here I'm referring to typical experiences on the entheogens of opening to a fundamental release from the strictures of our individual psycho-spiritual personalities and social personalities. Maybe also surrendering even judgment, surrendering any relationship in that moment to the future, to allow maximum internalization of being. Some people have sort of said being is a hunter. You open yourself, being will come hunting for you. And on the entheogens we can experience this. And this is the moment which I think in a period of increasing perilousness, more and more of us will be brought to through here, which is to say through hearts that get broken because they are attached one way or another to Maya, one way or another to the simulations, one way or another to that which is not true, and we can't live on it. There's a sort of way in a kind of existential umbilical cord here. We are connected to that which is underneath the social identities, where we get primary experiences of grappling with questions like, is this all to be trusted? Is it all fundamentally good? Does it mean anything? And often getting answers, though generally speaking they later become contestable answers. So that would be the first point. And I think in that, there's a way in which all of this process of surrendering to what can be revealed through the medicines can allow for the felt understanding of the new principle or aspects of the new principle that needs to be born. And I think we know some of the lineaments, some of the characteristics of that new principle. I think we can say that, and this is again a characteristic experience on the entheogens, that we understand in some deeper way that we do actually belong here. And here does actually, here, whether it be a local place or it be this planet, does actually belong in this, whatever this is. And crucially, this embedded belonging, which is a kind of a centering, it is a kind of finding of ourselves. It is an overcoming of the lostness, but this overcoming is not bought at the cost of freedom or consciousness or significance or love, as it is in the era of the modern self-legislating subject who is alienated from a deterministically conception of reality given in the natural sciences. Rather, what you have here is an understanding that love and consciousness and freedom are the deepest sources of our belonging. So I think that the entheogens are giving fuel to the emergence of precisely this kind of consciousness, or rather this new principle, this arche, this understanding of an ultimate. And here I just want to make a little quibble with what I think is often a kind of a common interpretation coming out of this, the entheogenic subculture, which would be a kind of tacit view that the ultimate exfoliation of the divine or of the absolute is me in a tambo understanding that I am God. Or maybe it's a couple of us standing around in a room and going, you're God, I'm God, you're God. Or it's even us going away and integrating. What I'm suggesting is that actually no, the ultimate exfoliation of the absolute would be the socio-political forms that instantiate that kind of knowing. And in that way, they would reach out on the one side to suffering nature, to the Gaian side, if you want, and on the other side to the techno-logos, and on the other side to the inequalities of wealth, and on the other side to the anomie, to the alienation, and be able to knit it together through this kind of principle of belonging. Finally, as a caveat, I want to say that to distinguish enthearchy from any kind of theocracy would be, I think, a virtue of these experiences is that they not only give fuel for symbolizations of the ultimate, they also help us to revise them and to qualify them, to relativize them, to see them as, in fact, parochial. So that I would speak definitely of an ecology of enthearchies as in principle where we might want to be hoping to go, but also of the entheogens as a source for a kind of agora, that is to say, a space of human, in the ordinary sense, symbolization of those ultimates in a conversation, in a philosophical, an attempt to get philosophical clarity. So I would argue that we have to guard against, but I don't think that we're likely to produce a kind of tyranny of the truth through the entheogens. It's something to guard against, obviously, but the kind of egalitarian and ecologically attuned enthearchy that I'm arguing for, it seems to me that there are reasons why the entheogens would help us to go in that direction rather than in the direction of any kind of authoritarianism.
If entheogens, as some people suspect, have been a very vital stimulant, energising these points of rapid, dramatic, cultural as well as biological evolution. But my worry is that because in the past, every one of these points of promise that entheogens have delivered to humanity has been an increase in intelligence, sophistication, and so on, whether it's possible to do that again and not risk going too far at once. Albert Einstein said, our biological capacity to keep up with our technology has run out. And can entheogens actually help us get over the need within ourselves to cope with what's needed next? Yeah. I wonder whether you think that it can really give rise to a major level of innovation that matches the extent of the crisis that we're now confronted by.
Look, I think we're in for a wild ride, to put it rather euphemistically, and I suspect that the entheogens, at some level, just make it more chaotic. You know, they amplify, in some ways, they will amplify the craziness. You know, when I went to Iquitos, I thought that's what this is doing. This is not only a crazy town, this is a crazy town on psychoactives, and a crazy town on psychoactives gets pretty wild, and you can imagine sort of generalizing that. On the other hand, you know, there's a sense in which you're never going to survive unless you get a little bit crazy, you know, and we want it to be a fertile craziness rather than just the death drive taking over in any number of ways that it's ready to take over. That would be one part of the answer. I guess another answer, or rather, let's say a response, would be, I think we're basically already in a period we could dub psychedelic capitalism. And I see entheogens not necessarily only emerging in a kind of bush retreat sort of situation. I think they may emerge in the matrix itself, if you want, as forms of attunement that there will be a social demand for, because anything else is literally insanity for a species like us. It's probably not insanity for an AI, but for a species with our kind of biology, our kind of emotionality, our kind of desire for significance, it will be insanity unless we can find, just as not all of us, many of us do when we're in a very deep journey, we go looking for the pure heart of the whole thing. To the degree that you can be deeply centered in that pure heart, to that degree you come out enlightened. And so I would imagine that we might enter a period where technology and so forth are in some kind of a loop with that sort of process, rather than just being a kind of external thing that we have to try to respond to.
When you said ecology and enthearchies, are you talking about various different communities with different socio-political structures and drugs involved in them? And how do you see that those don't kind of fall into the rat race again of my enthearchy is superior to your enthearchy? We biologically seem to have a thing where we like to fight. We like to dominate. Even with ideas, even with peaceful ideas, we still like to have our own version of peaceful idea be the dominant idea of life.
I think there's often a way in which people pitch an answer to a question like that, which would be, it's just possible that at the last minute the entheogens are going to come in and sort of stop all the nastiness happening. I don't think that's how it works. It's not going to be, you know, either breakdown or breakthrough. One of the symptoms that I didn't mention is the decline of the US empire, and in fact of the whole Euro-Anglo civilizational complex, which has been, you know, the site for the emergence of the dominant forms of the last two phases that I mentioned in terms of the arche, the transcendent, and also the modern self-legislating subject. In the context of the ecological crunch, we're almost certainly heading into imperialist wars, resource wars, etc. Entheogens are not going to stop that. My view is we can't stop breakdown. What we can do is have the possibility of breakthrough in the breakdown, rather than let's break through to stop the breakdown. So really it's more like, you know, when you pack your bags for this wild ride, are you going to pack some entheogens on the assumption that they might help, or are you not? There will be a selective pressure, as it were, to include them in the kit. And that's what I really hope. I hope that we can be smart enough in this period of relative peace to seed the knowing of these plants. People here are inheritors of this knowledge, to seed it in a way that will tend to be selected for in this, not in a context where everything's nice, but in a context where it gets really tough. And I think conversations around that kind of thing would be really useful, I think.